You were standing on a remote section of the Great Wall. You were looking north, toward the Mongolian border. The wind is biting, and honestly, the silence out here is absolute. It is the kind of quiet that feels heavy. You pull out your camera, you frame the shot, and that is when you notice it. The door. It is a full-sized, functional door set into the massive stone tower. But here's the thing. It is not facing the threat. It faces south, toward the heart of China. This, right here, is the first crack in the official narrative. We're told the Great Wall was built to keep invaders out, a defensive bulwark against northern nomadic tribes. Yet the architecture? It tells a completely different story. If this were purely a defensive shield, why do the towers have doors facing inward? Why do the battlements, which should provide cover from the north, often show structural orientation that suggests they were meant to defend against an assault from within? Now, I need to be clear. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is an investigation into physical anomalies that, frankly, rewrite the origins of one of the world's most famous structures. Look at the scale of this project. We're talking about 360 million cubic meters of earth and stone. If you were to disassemble the wall and stack it into a solid cube, you would be looking at a structure the size of a massive mountain, enough material to wrap around the Earth at the equator twice. The logistics required to move this volume of Earth, not to mention the quarried stone and fired brick, across the rugged, vertical ridges of the Yanshan Mountains, would cripple a modern supply chain. The history books tell us this was done by laborers under the Ming Dynasty, using simple tools and rice-based mortar. It is a compelling, heroic story, but the geology, it just does not support it. Let us look closer at the drainage systems. When you track the gradient of the stone pathways on top of the wall, you find that the water is channeled to flow specifically toward the south. The wall actually acts as a dam, shedding water away from the northern face and toward the Chinese heartland. If you were building a wall to keep an army out, you would engineer it to handle environmental stress from the outside, not to protect the southern face from water runoff. This is where architecture meets function, and the two are currently in a standoff. And then there is the matter of the foundations. We're often told the secret to the wall's longevity is the sticky rice mortar. While that might be true for specific later segments, well, not exactly. When you examine the deeper, more ancient foundations, the chemical composition changes completely. You see mortar that is fundamentally inconsistent with a rice-lime mix. It is harder, more mineral-dense, and it seems to have been poured or cast in a way that suggests a pre-industrial form of concrete technology. I almost glossed over this in my initial research, but it is critical. If these builders were not using local materials, and if they were using mortar technology that exceeds the capabilities of the period's standard construction, then the entire logistical narrative begins to unravel. We're left with a significant problem. If the builders were merely laborers working under simple military direction, how did they source, transport, and chemically engineer these complex, varied materials across such hostile vertical terrain? The reality is that the administrative structure required to orchestrate this, the food logistics, the tool manufacturing, the sheer architectural coordination, would have required a sophisticated, integrated, and perhaps even pre-existing infrastructure that the history books just do not account for. Which brings us to the more radical interpretations of the wall's origins. Some researchers point to what is known as the Tartarian hypothesis. This suggests that the Great Wall was not built by the Ming Dynasty, but rather it is a relic of a much older, more expansive, and perhaps globally connected architectural civilization that existed long before the current borders were drawn. When you look at the stones, you see evidence of precision fitting that mirrors megalithic sites in South America or the Middle East. It is not just piled rock, it is engineered masonry. Does this sound like a stretch? Perhaps. But look at the weathering patterns. Some sections of the foundations show levels of erosion that suggest they have been exposed to the elements for thousands of years longer than the documented timeline allows. The official history of the wall seems to be a thin veneer placed over a much deeper, older, and more complex archaeological reality. The wall remains, but the identity of the builders is locked in a vault that the historical record has yet to open. We are left with the stones themselves. They do not lie, and they do not conform to the dates on the plaques. The next time you see a photograph of the Great Wall, look past the brick and the tourists. Look at the doors, look at the drains, look at the foundation depth. When you start to question the origin of the material, you start to question the origin of the empire itself. Who really built the wall, and what were they actually protecting? The physical record is telling us to look again. Today, we aren't looking at bricks. We're looking at the ink. We're going to step behind the curtain of the Forbidden City's administrative heart to uncover how Imperial bureaucrats systematically edited an entire civilization's reality. The question isn't whether the Ming fixed the wall. The question is, why did they pretend they built it from scratch? Let's start by stepping into the silence of the Imperial archives. Close your eyes for a second. Imagine the smell of old paper, that scent of vanilla, dust, and slow decay. Thousands of scrolls stacked floor to ceiling in the Forbidden City, where the air never moves. This is where history was made, not on the battlefield, but at a desk. When you open those yellowed ledgers, you don't find the messy reality of construction. You find the sterile, curated precision of a state that desperately needed a win. Think of it as the original rebranding campaign. After the Mongol expulsion, the Ming were suffering a massive legitimacy crisis. They were an ethnically Han regime that had just ousted the Yuan Mongols. They were newcomers who felt like outsiders in their own empire. They needed to prove that they were not just occupants of the throne, but rightful owners of the land. They needed to demonstrate control over the wild, unruly frontiers that stretched for thousands of miles. So they looked north. They didn't see a ruin. They saw a resource. They saw a massive, ancient, megalithic artifact that had been sitting there for who knows how long, abandoned, overgrown, and ignored. And they realized that if they claimed it, they could own the narrative of China's defense. The Ming bureaucrats began their work. They didn't just repair the wall, they wrote it into existence. Wait until we get to the segment on the 15th century audit logs. They reveal exactly where the money was actually going. It wasn't buying mortar and stone, it was buying the silence of historical compilers. The state records are filled with the bureaucratic sealed archive stamp. When you see that seal on a document, it means the information is restricted, unassailable, and definitively the official truth. In these archives, the Ming records describe labor forces in the millions. Impossible numbers, really. These are figures that would require a logistical sophistication far beyond the famine-struck realities of the era. The math simply fails. You cannot feed, house, and coordinate 1 million people in the remote, barren terrain of the northern border with the supply chains of the 1400s. It is a mathematical impossibility, yet the books state it as gospel. They tell us that 1.5 million men were deployed. That's roughly equivalent to the entire population of a mid-sized modern European city, packed into a desolate mountain range. If you actually tried to feed that many men in that geography, the logistical chain would stretch longer than the wall itself. This is where the sealed archive becomes a confession. Why fabricate such a massive, impossible lie? Because the state needed to manufacture a monument of scale to match their imperial ego. They needed the world and their own citizens to believe that the Ming were not just a government, but the architects of civilization itself. This is the bureaucratic filter. State censors ensured only one version of the wall's origin reached the public. If a local commander wrote a report noting that the new wall section was built on top of foundations that were already crumbling with age, that report never saw the light of day. It was suppressed. And this is where the 1513 Admiral's map enters our investigation. It's a smoking gun. This map, created by a naval official not bound by the immediate pressures of the northern border politics, depicts the frontier with startling, brutal honesty. It draws fortifications that physically predate the state's own construction timeline. It shows structures that don't match Ming building techniques, but rather something older, heavier, more alien. When you overlay this map with the official Ming records, the discrepancy is, well, it's jarring. It's as if the state is describing a skyscraper while the physical map is showing you a trench. The map suggests the Ming were not builders, but scavengers. They were moving into an existing defensive structure that someone else had left behind. They were squatters in a palace built by giants. It's a chilling thought. History isn't just about what happened, it is about what we are told happened, reinforced by the weight of millions of pages of ink. The reality is that the Ming didn't build a national shield. They inherited a massive, ancient artifact and claimed it to legitimize a fragile throne. It was a bold, bureaucratic fiction that has survived for centuries simply because it was written down with enough authority. Think about the scale of it. We are talking about thousands of miles of stone, transformed by the stroke of a brush from a relic into a legacy. Every brick we touch today at the tourist sites is filtered through that 15th century propaganda machine. It makes me wonder about the nature of power itself. If the most visible monument on the planet is an act of historical rebranding, what else have we accepted as fact simply because the ink was dry when we arrived? We are taught that the Great Wall is a defensive barrier, a stone line drawn against a tide of primitive barbarians. You know the image: nomadic tribes on horseback, defined by their supposed savagery, their lack of structure, their chaos. History books paint them as simple, hungry raiders. But wait, if they were truly so primitive, how do we explain the complex, fortified ruins they left scattered across the Gobi Desert? We are going to look at a massive, physical, archaeological disconnect. The gap between the so-called primitive nomadic tribes recorded in history books and the high-tech, fortified, and logistically complex reality found in the earth beneath the steppe. The history books say they were savages. The ruins? Well, the ruins tell a different story entirely. And that leads to a bigger, uncomfortable question. If the most visible monument on the planet is built on a lie about our past, what else have we been taught that simply isn't true? Take a mental step through one of those southward-facing doors, trek across the northern plains, and leave the Ming Dynasty's narrative behind. We are standing in the middle of the Gobi, looking out over the Mongolian steppe. The history books frame this region as a void of civilization, a chaotic, dusty expanse where nomads roamed, waiting to strike the soft underbelly of the south. It is a clean, simple story. Sedentary order on one side, barbarian chaos on the other. But once you actually look at the terrain, really look at it, the chaos starts to look remarkably structured. I am not seeing a landscape of aimless wanderers. I am seeing clear, geometric footprints of permanent settlements, foundations etched into the dust that do not belong to a temporary camp. And this is the part that hits you. Why are these ruins built with a precision that mimics the wall we just left? Here's the weird thing. We are taught that these northern nomadic tribes were essentially just restless wanderers. They didn't settle, they didn't build, and they certainly didn't engineer. But then you look at the archaeological record, and the physical reality hits you like a cold, biting wind. When you get boots on the ground at these northern sites, you aren't finding temporary camps made of hide and wood. You are finding massive stone-walled strongholds. The engineering isn't primitive. In many cases, you see sophisticated drainage channels and precisely fitted masonry that look, honestly, remarkably like the very wall the Ming claimed to build. It is a massive paradox. How do you reconcile a supposed primitive raider culture with fortress engineering that matches the state-of-the-art of the empires they were allegedly just raiding? To understand who we are really talking about, we need to leave the Ming Dynasty's library behind and head into the Orkhan Valley, deep within the modern-day Mongolian steppe. Archaeologists here have uncovered the remains of Ordu-Baliq. This was a sprawling urban capital. It had permanent stone-walled structures, advanced drainage systems, and evidence of a central administrative authority that would make a Ming bureaucrat feel, well, a little inadequate. The records of the time scream primitive raiders, but the physical evidence shows a civilization with a sophisticated permanent state structure that was far more stable than the nomadic reputation implies. We have been conditioned to view the steppe as a place of chaos, and because of that, we tend to ignore the obvious signs of structural engineering that date back centuries. It is the same cognitive dissonance we see with the wall itself. The official narrative tells us one story, while the ground is literally shouting another. Now, we have to address the elephant in the room. This rigid, persistent caricature of the primitive northern barbarian. Why did the Ming Dynasty go to such lengths to paint their neighbors as unwashed, illiterate raiders? It wasn't just a matter of historical bias. It was calculated political rebranding. Think of it as a state-sponsored 2R campaign. By framing the northern nomadic powers as disorganized, savage, and culturally stagnant, the Ming bureaucrats were doing something very clever and very manipulative. They were creating a moral and existential justification for the wall. If you are the Ming, you don't just build a wall because you want to. You build a wall because you are defending civilization itself against the chaotic other. It effectively turned a border dispute into a binary of civilization versus savagery. It is a narrative trap, and it is one we are still stuck in 500 years later. It is frustrating. When we look at the historical record of these northern groups, we aren't looking at objective anthropology. We are reading 500-year-old PR material from a Ming dynasty that was desperate to cast their rivals as primitive to secure its own legitimacy. When we started this investigation, we were looking at a door, a simple, functional door facing the wrong way. But look at where we have ended up. We have moved from those stones to the ink that covers them. The official narrative relies on the primitive raider archetype to justify the wall's existence, but the physical evidence does not just nudge that narrative, it dismantles it. We are left with a massive, uncomfortable gap. If the northern nomadic civilizations were as sophisticated as the engineering of their remains suggests, then what was their true relationship with the southern dynasties? Were they really just raiders, or were they co-architects, political equals, or something else entirely that the Imperial records simply refuse to acknowledge? The Ming bureaucrats didn't just build a wall, they built a reality. They used the printing press to turn complex, highly capable neighbors into cartoonish caricatures, effectively erasing a sophisticated state from the map. Makes me realize that the wall isn't just a barrier in the landscape, it is a boundary for our history. If the most famous monument on Earth is an act of historical rebranding, what else have we accepted as fact simply because the ink was dry when we arrived?